One winter night they survived by the same fire. Years later, thunder found them again, and the storm remembered what the snow had started. One winter night they survived by the same fire. Years later, thunder found them again, and the storm remembered what the snow had started. Cold arrived like a verdict. It squared the sky into iron and pared sound to brittle things, branch ticks, ice settling, breath that cracked in the air. David had pushed too far, following elk sign into a high basin, and night fell faster than the route out. Wind braided snow into ropes that tugged at his coat and found glove seams. He chose the line that would cost the least, down into trees, across the ridge shoulder, into a lee where a granite boulder shouldered weather. The forest closed in a resin-sweet hush. By the time he scraped a pit and stacked kindling with wooden fingers, the cold had a weight he could feel in his teeth. Fire was work and prayer. He cupped a match, offered the first fragile color, and built a low, tight cone. The flame took, then decided in his favor. Heat drew a small, convincing circle in a world that had erased circles. Snow hissed and learned the small fire. He ate slow, hard bread, meat that remembered salt. Steam threaded from his tin mug. Wind thinned and returned in cold hands. He settled into the work of staying. The sound reached him then, thin, high, halting. Not owl. Not fox. A small animal's plea stripped to need. He stared into the fire until its afterimage took his eyes, then looked beyond. Two shapes ghosted from the trees, shadows carved in fur and bone. Bear cubs? The first stepped like a creature that had learned night too young, low, careful, eyes catching ember red. The second hovered behind, shivering in the wrong rhythm, panic. Their coats were rimed with ice where breath had frozen. No sow's chuff followed. His body knew one answer and his mind another. He kept his hands on his knees and did not look full on. The cubs read the heat with the precision of hunger. They came to the edge and stopped, forepaws just outside the melted rim. The smaller made the thin sound again, then folded to its haunches as if cold had shot a string through its spine. He eased his pack with a boot, tugged a wool blanket free. He did not reach toward them. He laid the blanket at his side, closer to the fire, and shifted so the open half of the circle lay between them like an invitation made of absence. Then he waited. The first cub stepped into wet snow and flinched at the shock, the second pressed its shoulder and stayed. Minutes layered. The smell of singed hair arrived, not theirs, but his at heat's edge, and with it the careful shift of a boundary. The first cub stepped in. The second followed, claws scraping rock as if to anchor. They settled like animals who've run out of moves, all at once, the surrender total. The smaller curled tight until its ribs shuddered against themselves, the larger arranged its body to block the wind. David turned the blanket once to warm it, then slid it across the snow without lifting it from the ground. The larger watched his hand, head low. He left the wool where their heat and his met. The smaller found the nap first. It pressed its cheek into the weave and made a sound that was no cry now, but a long unspooling. The larger lowered its chin onto the blanket's edge. Steam rose from their fur in steady threads, a weather all their own. He fed the fire small bones of wood, kept it from greed. Sparks rose and died against the night's hard dome. Time turned slow. Once a distant crack traveled the trunks like a decision. Once the wind drew a clean knife through the stand and was gone. Hunger came and was ignored. Thirst he answered with snow melted and cooled so it would not bite their tongues if they came closer. They did not. They slept the way the hurt sleep, so deeply the body does not ask permission. When the smaller woke in a panic jerk, the larger shunted closer, their breaths braided until the rhythm matched. Near dawn the cold deepened, as it does. The fire pinched small, then found itself again. David's feet numbed and returned. His mind walked old rooms to keep from pacing the one he sat in. He thought of a boy in a museum pressing his palm to glass over a winter diorama, painted wolves, painted light. The glass had been warm. This was not. When the sky thinned from iron to lead, the cubs uncoiled. The larger rose and shook, a rustle like paper. The smaller stood on stiff legs, then rubbed its face along the dark wool, imprinting smoke, and man and a night survived. They looked at him then, really looked. Not past, not through. Their eyes were raw with the honesty cold gives. He did not raise his hands. He blinked slow. The larger blinked back, the long kind that closes a gate without noise. Then it turned. The smaller hesitated, inventorying the circle, blanket, rock, man, fire, then pivoted after. They left no sound worth a ledger. Snow closed over their prints as the light gathered. He fed the last of the dry sticks and held his hands above the coals until sensation returned as ache. By noon he would be back on a safe line, the basin behind him, the lesson for once learned without blood. But the circle they'd shared stayed bright in his mind long after the snow took the last ash. It was a mark no storm could scrub. Some debts winter writes in ice. They keep until weather changes. Years bled the winter's edge away. Snow gave to spring, spring to summers that baked the ridges until pine needles cracked underfoot. The memory of that night stayed quiet but intact, the way certain smells live behind a door in the mind, waiting to be opened by accident. David rarely spoke of it. In the valley town, talk of bears was weather talk. They'd seen one near the mill, one downriver, one at the pass. No one marked their years. Work kept him inland, carpentry in the thaw, surveying in the dry months, guiding hunts he never took part in. He measured his seasons in tools doled and resharpened, boots replaced, maps amended. Still, sometimes in deep snow, he'd feel eyes in the tree line, not hostile, not quite curious. He never chased the feeling. By late July the heat had thickened the air to syrup. Rivers ran low between bared stones. Days carried dust. Then the weather broke. It came from the west in a rolling bruise of sky, green threaded with black, the horizon flashing in pulses. The forest felt it first, stillness in the canopy, birds dropping lower, the hum of insects cutting like someone had drawn a blade through the air. Wind arrived as a single push, hot at its front, cool at its tail. David was on the north trail, returning from marking a footbridge site above the third bend. His pack was heavy with stakes and twine, his boots were striped with creek mud. When the light shifted, not dimmed, but tinted into that sickly green, he stopped. The air had weight now, the kind that pressed against skin before rain. The pine's tops swayed once, twice, then leaned as a sheet of wind poured down the slope. Lightning walked the far ridge, silent in its distance, a flat vein of white against the black. He thought about heading back to the cabin by the lower spur, faster, more shelter. But the wind had a vector to it, tugging him along the main trail toward the high clearing where two ridges met. From there, you could see the whole western sky. He made the climb in the charged quiet between gusts. The clearing opened sudden, meadow grass bowing under the push of air. Clouds moved too fast for comfort. The first drops hit in fat, warm coins. He was halfway across when he saw them. Shapes at the tree-lean opposite, two, broad at the shoulder, motion tight against the wind's shove. Bears. Not cubs, not anymore. The larger silhouette still carried the same solid line he remembered from that night, the way she'd leaned into wind to shield the smaller. The smaller was nearly her size now, but the set of the head, the way it turned in rhythm with hers, was unchanged. They stood in the green dark light, rain knitting the air between them. He did not move forward, not yet. The clearing between was open, exposed. Lightning cracked somewhere close enough that the sound rolled into the air almost at once. The larger stepped out first, paws sinking in wet grass. The smaller followed, ears pivoting, reading the weather as much as him. They crossed half the clearing before stopping, the line of their bodies angled against the wind. David took one step forward, then another, until the rain was in his eyes and his shirt stuck to his back. The sky pressed lower, thunder spoke again. Between them stretched years and a single winter's fire. The bears held their ground. He stopped short of the midway point, close enough that they could read him, far enough that the choice remained theirs. Water ran from his hair into his collar, the scent of wet grass and ozone wrapped the clearing. They stayed like that through one lightning flash, then another, until the wind shifted and brought with it the smell of pine pitch and the river below, the same scents that had braided through smoke that night long ago. It was the smaller who moved first. The smaller bear's first step was slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that makes no claim until it must. Rain slicked its fur, darkening the brown to near black, beads forming on the longer guard hairs before rolling free. The larger bear held her ground, head slightly lowered, watching both David and the younger's path. David didn't move. The summer storm had turned the meadow into a living thing, grass folding and righting itself in waves, water sheeting in the gusts. Thunder groaned low in the sky, deep enough to be felt in the ribs. His boots sank into the softening soil. The smaller crossed 10 yards, then 20. Each pace was matched to the flicker of its ears, reading him the way animals do, for stillness, for intention, for the unmeant move. David's hands stayed visible at his sides, open. He could feel his own breathing in the space between thunder beats. When the bear reached 30 paces, it stopped and lifted its head fully. Their eyes met, dark, unshining, yet catching the pale green light the storm made of everything. And in that moment David felt the exact weight of the years since that night by the fire, the thin line of wool blanket between them, the frost steaming from their coats. The bear huffed, not a warning, not a threat, but something like clearing a window. It stepped closer. The larger bear moved now, but not toward him. She angled around, a slow arc that placed her between the meadow's edge and the smaller's flank. Not to block, but to guard the open. Lightning split the far ridge, the crack of it rolled in on a wave of wind that slapped the rain sideways. David took one step forward. The smaller stopped, waiting. Another step, and the distance between them was close enough for him to see the thick muscle at the bear's shoulder shift with breath. He could smell the wet fur now, that wild mix of earth and rain and the faint tang of river stone. They stood like that, the storm kneeling around them. The meadow flattened under gusts, water pooling between the tougher tufts. Rain ran in threads down David's cheek, into the line of his jaw. His breath fogged for an instant in the cooler pocket of air that came with each downdraft. The smaller's eyes didn't leave his. They were not the eyes of an animal that had forgotten. From behind, the larger gave a deep, almost inaudible rumble, a sound David felt more than heard. It wasn't for him. It was for the younger, an affirmation. The smaller shifted closer, 3 steps, until they shared the same patch of flattened grass. David could see the lines of old scars beneath the thick coat, faint but present, life written in marks. He didn't reach out. That was not the language here. Instead, he bowed his head just slightly, the way he might to an elder in the village, or to the mountain itself when crossing a pass. The bear's head tilted, a mirror, rain dripping from its muzzle. Then, almost casually, it turned, walking past him toward the ridge path that climbed away from the meadow. The larger followed, pausing only to glance at him once, a quick, precise acknowledgement before vanishing into the downpour. David stood alone in the meadow, the smell of them still in the air, the storm folding around him as if they had simply stepped into another room. The bear's tracks were already pooling with rainwater by the time David reached the start of the ridge trail. The soil here was dark and rich, releasing its deep earth smell in the wet. Each paw print was an imprint of power, wide, clear, with claws scoring short lines ahead of the pads. The larger steps were measured, deliberate, while the smallers cut in at a tighter angle, pressing deeper into the mud, as if testing the ground or quickening to keep pace. The wind was stronger higher up, funneling through the narrowing spine of the ridge. Pine trunks swayed with a creak that came and went, like old ships shifting at dock. He kept his footing by leaning slightly forward, boots biting into softened clay and wet roots. Water streamed down the trail in ribbons, making every step an act of care. Ahead, through the sheeting rain, he caught flashes of movement, the darker shadow within shadows. The smaller bear was just visible when the wind parted the curtain of rain, climbing with a steady rhythm. The larger was always a shape beyond, never fully clear but always there. Thunder rolled again, closer now, a sound that filled the space between trees and pressed against his chest. Lightning flared over the valley, whitening the world for an instant. In that brief clarity, he saw the ridgeline curve toward a rocky outcrop, and the cabin below it. Not his cabin. Not anyone's he knew. This one sat lower on the far side of the ridge, hidden from the meadow and the main trail, its roof a sagging patchwork of cedar shakes and moss. Smoke did not rise from the chimney, but the dark mouth of the doorway was open. The bears moved toward it without hesitation. David slowed. This was no coincidence. Animals avoided human scent unless there was cause, and cause was rarely good. Yet the smaller bear stopped at the doorway and looked back, rain plastering its fur to its frame. It didn't move until he took another step forward. The ground near the cabin was slick with mud and pine needles, the slope feeding water down into the clearing. The larger bear moved past the doorway and into the trees beyond, standing watch. The smaller waited until David closed half the distance, then turned and slipped inside. He paused at the threshold. The smell of the place was heavy, old wood, damp earth, and something else faint beneath it, a trace of smoke from years gone. The light inside was dim, what little there was filtered through a broken shutter and the rain-dark doorway. The first thing he saw was the fire pit, a circle of stones sunk into the packed dirt floor, blackened by long use. And in that blackness, faint under the layers of ash, was the ghost of a wool thread. It stopped him cold. Rain whispered on the roof, louder over the leak that dripped into the corner. The smaller bear stood by the far wall, its head turned toward him, eyes holding the kind of stillness that came from recognition. He stepped inside. The air was cooler, quieter, as though the storm outside was muffled by more than wood. His boots found the familiar crunch of ash underfoot. The pit's stones were smooth at the edges, worn by years of heat. He knelt and brushed at the ash until the pale coil of wool came free, brittle now, but still holding the faintest shape of its weave. It was the same weave as that blanket. The same blanket from that winter fire. His throat tightened, the sound of the rain receding until all he could hear was his own breathing and the small shift of paws on dirt. David stayed crouched beside the fire pit longer than he meant to, the brittle thread of wool balanced in his palm. It was nothing to anyone else, a scrap, a ruin, but to him, it was the hinge between seasons, the single tangible proof that night had been more than memory. Rain pattered through the roof's gaps, striking the dirt in rhythmic taps. The smell of wet wood and old ash pulled the years closer. The smaller bear shifted its weight, claws clicking softly on the floorboards along the wall. Its head was angled toward the back corner, where shadow pressed thickest. The larger bear had not entered but stood at the doorway, massive shoulders blocking half the light. David followed the younger's gaze. At first, the corner seemed empty, just the sloped boards and a stack of old cedar poles leaning at an angle. But then, in the dim, he caught the faintest quiver of movement, too small to be wind. He rose slowly, the wool scrap still in his fingers, and crossed the short distance. The boards underfoot sagged slightly with his weight, water seeped along the seams. The poles weren't stacked at random, they had been set deliberately, forming a kind of screen. He eased one aside. Behind it was a hollow no larger than a grain bin. Inside, on a nest of dry pine needles, lay a fox, ribs sharp under wet fur, one hind leg twisted at an angle nature didn't make. Its eyes were half-lidded, but when they opened, they fixed on him with the same watchful tension he'd seen in the bears. The air in the cabin felt suddenly smaller. This was why they'd led him here. He glanced back. The smaller bear was motionless, head lowered but gaze steady. The larger's ears flicked back against a gust, but she didn't move. David crouched again, setting the wool scrap gently on the floor. He spoke low, just enough to lay his voice into the air without crowding it. The fox didn't flinch, but its breathing quickened. The leg injury was old enough for swelling to have gone down but fresh enough to keep it from moving far. He slid his pack off his shoulder and unbuckled the side pouch. Inside, wrapped in wax cloth, was a strip of dried meat. He laid it on the floor between them, then eased back, letting the air stretch. Rain hammered the roof harder now, the storm's weight pressing into the cabin. The fox lifted its head by degrees, the line of its neck trembling. Its nose twitched, catching the scent, but it didn't cross the distance. David stayed still. Eventually, the fox lowered its head again, conserving what it had. This wasn't going to be solved in one moment. And maybe that was the point. The bears hadn't brought him here for a rescue, not exactly. They'd brought him because the fire had once been shared, and this was a place where sharing still mattered. He stood and stepped back to the fire pit. The smaller bear's gaze tracked him. The larger's head turned slightly, watching the line of the rain through the open door. David knew he couldn't stay long. Storms in the high country often gave way to flash floods down the slopes, but leaving this place exactly as he'd found it didn't feel right. He reached into his pack for his water flask, poured a thin stream into a flat tin lid, and set it near the fox's nest. Then he laid the wax cloth-wrapped meat beside it. The fox didn't move, but its eyes stayed on him now, unblinking. The bears had not shifted either, as though holding the air steady for the exchange. Finally, David stepped back toward the doorway. The larger bear moved aside, the rain's full scent rushing in with the wind. Outside, the clearing had become a shallow lake, the ground reflecting the churned sky. He glanced once more inside. The fox was watching him, the tin of water and strip of meat between them like small markers of a bridge not yet crossed. Then he stepped out into the storm. The rain outside was heavier now, thick enough to blur the trees at the clearing's edge into moving smudges of dark. Water ran in shallow rivers across the ground, carrying pine needles and small stones downslope. David pulled his coat tighter, feeling the chill creep in beneath the storm's heat. The larger bear stepped into the clearing first, testing the ground. Her head moved side to side, reading the wind in quick, efficient arcs. The smaller followed, glancing back at David before loping a short distance toward the ridge trail. There was no hesitation in their direction, they were already choosing a path. David gave one last look into the cabin. The fox hadn't moved, but the meat was gone, the wax cloth lying slack where it had been. The tin of water was half empty. It was enough to ease the edge of the worry. He pulled the door halfway closed, more for the sound than the weather. The rain on the roof dimmed as he stepped fully outside. The mud took his boots deep in the first few strides, making him lean forward to free each step. The bears moved with the easy stability of weight distributed by instinct, claws gripping earth where his soles slid. He followed their line, placing his feet in the high parts of their tracks when he could. As they reached the base of the ridge, the wind shifted hard, driving the rain sideways. David knew this pattern. A pressure drop like this meant the storm's center was about to cross the valley. That could bring sudden torrents down the gullies, washing out lower trails. The bears knew it too. They angled upslope, toward higher ground where runoff wouldn't funnel into a trap. Lightning cracked close enough to make the air shake. David caught a brief, perfect silhouette of the larger bear against the sky, head lifted, ears forward, before the light blinked away. He matched his breathing to their steady pace, finding a rhythm in the climb. The ridge path narrowed to no more than 3 boot widths, the drop on his left disappearing into mist and shadow. Water sheeted over the stones, turning them slick underfoot. The smaller bear slowed here, looking back once to be sure he was following, then continuing up. By the time they reached a small plateau, a shelf of granite just below the ridge's true crest, the rain had softened into mist. The air up here was cooler, sharper, holding the scent of wet stone and crushed grass. Below, the valley was still hidden in the storm's belly, the dark green of the forest blurred to watercolor. The larger bear moved to the edge of the shelf, scanning the drop. The smaller stayed closer to David, its breath slow and even now. There was no push for him to leave, but there was a quiet presence in their stance, the same unspoken understanding from that winter fire. David eased his pack down and sat on the flat granite, letting the rain mist bead on his coat. From here, he could see the cabin's clearing far below, a pale shape among the dark pines. It looked like something from a dream, so near and yet unreachable without the path they'd shown him. The bears didn't linger. When the wind shifted again, carrying with it the smell of calmer air from the east, they turned in unison and started back along the higher ridge trail. The smaller gave a final glance, not stopping, but letting the connection hold for a breath, before following. David stayed long enough to watch their shapes dissolve into the fog. Then he shouldered his pack and began the slow, careful descent toward his own trail home. The trail down from the ridge felt longer than the climb had. Wet clay and slick roots made every step a calculation. The air was different now, the storm's force had passed, leaving the valley wrapped in a damp, muffled calm. The only sounds were the drip of water from pine needles and the occasional distant groan of a branch settling under its weight. David's boots left dark prints in the soaked soil, each one filling quickly with a skin of water. His coat was heavy with rain, shoulders aching under the pack. He moved steadily, but his mind stayed on the plateau above, on the wet silhouettes fading into fog. By mid-afternoon, the trail eased into the wider switchbacks that led toward the valley floor. Here, the forest opened into groves of aspen, their white trunks slick and shining against the green. The leaves whispered with the lightest breeze, a faint counterpoint to the heavier drip from the pines. He stopped at a break in the trees where the land fell away to reveal the river. It ran high and fast from the storm, churning around dark boulders, its surface freckled with floating debris. The color was a pale green-gray, thick with silt. The sound carried even up here, low and constant. A lone heron stood motionless at the river's edge, neck stretched toward the current. It reminded him, in a strange way, of the larger bear, that stillness, that precise reading of the world's small shifts. By the time he reached the lower trail junction, the clouds had broken into ragged strips, letting the sun through in uneven gold. Steam rose from the undergrowth, curling in the shafts of light. The warmth was welcome, but the sudden change only made the morning storm feel more distant, like it had happened in another place. In the clearing where his own small cabin sat, the smell of wet cedar hung thick. He set his pack down on the porch, listening to the roof's slow drip. Inside, he lit the stove, the small fire snapping easily in the dry pine he'd kept under cover. The familiar crackle filled the space, but it didn't have the same weight as that winter fire had, or the same charged air as the storm on the ridge. He hung his coat to dry, sat at the small table, and unrolled his map. His eyes found the stretch of ridge they'd crossed, the high meadow where he'd first seen them in the storm. He traced the route to the hidden cabin. It wasn't marked on any chart, but now he could see how its position fit the land's shape, invisible from most approaches, guarded by slope and tree line. The map stayed open while his tea cooled. He wasn't sure why he kept looking at it, except that part of him felt the day wasn't done. The bears had led him somewhere with purpose, that much was clear. But the sense remained that there was another step in whatever they'd started. As dusk approached, the sky cleared fully, the last of the storm's color gone from the horizon. A thin moon rose above the pines. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. David stepped onto the porch to breathe it in and froze. Up the trail, no more than 30 yards away, two shapes stood in the growing dark. The smaller's head was low, ears forward, the larger stood behind, a steady shadow. They didn't move toward him, didn't retreat. They simply held the space, the same way they had in the meadow. This wasn't over. Not yet. The pale rim of the moon hung above the treetops, just high enough to silver the damp leaves and lay faint light along the trail. The air had cooled sharply since sunset, the kind of cold that lifts steam from the earth and sharpens every scent. David could smell the wet cedar of his porch, the faint tang of ash from his stove, and beneath it, the heavier, organic musk that marked the bear's presence. They stood as they had before, the smaller in front, the larger slightly behind, angled as if guarding the retreat back into the forest. The stillness was deliberate, a pause meant for him to decide. David stepped off the porch slowly, boots crunching in the shallow gravel before sinking into the softened trail. The smaller bear's head lifted a fraction, then it turned, padding silently up the slope away from the cabin. The larger followed, her bulk moving without sound except for the occasional brush of fur against low branches. The night was quiet enough that each step he took seemed too loud. The forest was awake in its own way, an owl's short, questioning call from somewhere higher on the ridge, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by unseen animals in the understory. The trail was narrow, hemmed in by stands of young pines whose wet needles brushed against his shoulders. The bears kept a steady pace, not hurrying, but not lingering either. The smaller glanced back every so often, just enough to ensure he was there. When the moon broke free of a thin drift of cloud, its light caught the wet sheen of their coats, outlining the curves of muscle beneath. They led him toward a part of the valley he rarely visited, a north-facing slope where the trees grew closer together and the ground was carpeted with thick moss. The damp here was heavier, the air cooler. His boots sank slightly with each step, muffling the sound of his movements. After nearly half an hour, the trail bent toward a shallow ravine. Water still trickled there from the afternoon's storm, running over stones slick with lichen. The smaller bear crossed first, leaping the narrowest span without breaking stride. The larger stepped down into the ravine itself, picking her way over the rocks before climbing the opposite bank. David followed, planting his feet carefully on the wet stone. The water was cold against his boots, seeping through to his socks in seconds. On the far side, the trail climbed again, winding between boulders draped in ferns. The moonlight thinned here, the canopy closing overhead. It was almost fully dark when the path finally widened into a small clearing. The air in the clearing felt different, quieter, heavier. The smaller bear stopped at the center, turning to face him. The larger settled near the edge, watching the trees beyond. David took a few steps forward before he saw it, a mound at the clearing's far end, half hidden under moss and fallen branches. It wasn't natural. The stones had been placed with purpose, forming a low cairn no more than waist high. Time and weather had worn it, but the shape was still clear. He didn't move closer yet. The smaller bear gave a short, almost imperceptible chuff, then lowered its head. The air between them carried that same charged stillness he'd felt in the cabin, by the fire pit, in the storm. Something here mattered to them, and now to him. David approached the mound slowly, each step sinking into the thick carpet of moss. The air felt denser here, as if the trees themselves were leaning in. Moonlight pooled unevenly across the stones, catching on the pale edges where lichen hadn't yet grown. Rainwater from the earlier storm still clung to the moss, dampening his knees when he crouched. The cairn was old, older than his cabin, older than any of the game trails he followed in the high country. The stones were river-rounded, some no larger than his fist, others wide enough to require both hands to move. They had been placed deliberately, each layer resting firmly on the next. The smaller bear had moved closer, no more than 3 paces away, its eyes following his every motion. The larger remained at the tree-line, scanning the forest as though guarding against anything that might disturb the moment. David set his hand on one of the upper stones. It was cool, slick with moisture. Beneath it, the faintest trace of something different touched his fingertips, not stone, not soil. He shifted the rock aside carefully, setting it on the moss beside him. The next layer down was lined with sticks, each one stripped of bark. He peeled them back one by one until the hollow beneath was revealed. Inside, wrapped in what looked like a scrap of animal hide, was a small bundle. The hide was darkened with age, edges frayed, but it had kept the contents dry. He hesitated before unwrapping it, aware of the bear's attention pressing in. The smaller's ears tilted forward, the larger's breath audible even from the edge of the clearing. Inside the hide was a strip of wool unmistakable in its weave and color, even after years. It matched the blanket from that winter long ago. The same blanket that had circled the fire where man and cubs had survived the night together. This piece had been cut cleanly, its edges even, as though deliberately kept. Underneath the wool was something else, a small carved figure, no taller than his thumb. It was a bear, rough but unmistakable, shaped from pale river stone. The carving was simple, but the form was balanced, shoulders hunched, head slightly turned as if listening. David felt the weight of it in his palm, heavier than it should have been for its size. The stone was smooth from handling, the kind of wear that comes only from years of being held. The smaller bear gave a low, deep exhale, almost like a sigh. It stepped forward until it was within arm's reach, eyes fixed not on him but on the stone figure in his hand. He didn't know who had made it, or why it had been hidden here with the wool. But he knew, without needing to be told, that this cairn had been a place of keeping, a place where memory was laid down and trusted to stay. Carefully, he rewrapped the wool and the carving in the hide. He replaced the sticks, then set the stones back exactly as they'd been. When he was done, the cairn looked untouched. The smaller bear stepped back, lifting its head. The larger gave a single, deep chuff from the tree-line, a sound that resonated through the quiet. David rose to his feet, the cool damp of the moss still clinging to his hands. The moonlight had shifted, the clearing now silvered evenly, the cairn standing at its center like a quiet sentinel. This was no accident. They had brought him here so he would know and remember. David stood for a long moment after restoring the cairn, his breath misting faintly in the cool air. The forest around them was quiet in a way that wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the deep, settled quiet of a place where something had been acknowledged. The smaller bear shifted first, turning away from the cairn and padding toward the tree-line. The larger moved to follow, her steps measured, unhurried. David let them lead, falling in a few paces behind. The moonlight filtered in shifting fragments through the branches, catching on their wet coats and his damp jacket. The trail they took was not the one they had arrived on. This one wound gently downslope, weaving through pockets of fern and clusters of young spruce. The ground here was springy with layers of old needles, muffling the sound of their passage. Now and then, the smaller bear would pause, glancing back at him before continuing on, as if to make sure the space between them stayed intact. They crossed the shallow ravine again, but higher up where the stones were dry. Moonlight flashed off the water below, a thin silver thread winding through the dark. On the far bank, the forest opened slightly, giving them a view across the valley. Clouds drifted low over the opposite ridge, their undersides pale with reflected moonlight. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. Somewhere far off, an owl called, its note carrying in the stillness. David felt the weight of the night in his bones, but it was not the same as fatigue. It was the heaviness of having been given something not entirely his, but trusted to him all the same. When they neared the edge of the pines above his cabin, the smaller bear stopped. The larger came to stand beside it, their shoulders almost touching. They held there for a moment, the three of them looking down at the dark roof and the small square of moonlit porch. The larger bear turned her head toward him. Her eyes caught the light, holding it for an instant before she looked back to the trail behind her. The smaller followed her lead, stepping into the shadow of the forest. David stood and watched until they were gone, their shapes blending into the blackness between the trees. Only the faint rustle of wet leaves marked their passing. When he stepped onto his porch, the boards creaked the way they always did, but the sound seemed smaller somehow. Inside, the stove still held a few coals from earlier. He stirred them back to life, the orange glow painting the walls. On the table, he unrolled his map again. His fingertip traced the line from his cabin to the cairn, marking it in his mind. No pencil, no ink, just memory. He didn't know when he would see them again. But the winter fire, the summer storm, and this night under the moon were now linked, a thread carried through seasons and years, as real as the stones that kept the cairn standing. And when the time came, he would follow them again.